We're going to be taking a look at building smart and resilient cities as we adapt to a new normal. And we've heard so much about this in the last 4 days, really looking ahead to the future and to looking ahead to the future of cities and how we live there and how people enjoy their lives there and how they can be sustainable. So very important here. And I think it's something that we're really hearing from everybody right across the world as we've had our expert speakers help us to understand what it means to actually build better and to build more sustainability into what we do. So this final session, we're going to be taking a look at just that. And from Engaging Futures in Australia, we're really delighted that we have the Managing Director, Dr. Colin Russo, is going to join us for this panel. Also, Emily Yates from the City of Philadelphia, and she's the Smart City Director. Shakil Ahmed, an educator, a futurist, a storyteller. He's indeed the manager of Acumen Academy. He's going to take part in this. And our moderator for this session, Mohammad Asfour, the regional head for MENA and Africa Network for the World Green Building Council. So we have a great lineup, and Mohammed's going to moderate this session now. And I'll come back for a Q&A afterwards before we close off. But stay with us now as Mohammad starts this session, Building Smart and Resilient Cities. Mohammad, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Etna. And welcome everyone to our panel discussion today, where we will be discussing building smart and resilient cities, adapting to the new normal. With us today is an amazing group of panelists. From Australia, we have Dr. Colin Russo, Managing Director, Engaging Futures. From the US, we have Emily Yates, Smart City Director, City of Philadelphia. And from Bangladesh, we have Shakil Ahmed, who's an educator, futurist, and storyteller, and manager at the Acumen Academy. Personally, I first got involved in the discussion around cities back in 2008, when we held the Eco Cities of the Mediterranean conference here in Jordan. Since then, I have been carefully observing how cities have been responding to increasing numbers of dwellers and addressing climate change. And just to give our audience a sense of the magnitude of the issue, I would like to bring my city story as an example. First recorded traces of human civilization in Amman go back to around 9,000 years ago. But until the turn of the 20th century, around 10,000 people only called the city home. Today, there are 4 million people living here. What took London 1,500 years to grow in population took Amman less than 100. This expansion causes so much stress on resources, biodiversity, and more. This reality describes the situation in many cities all over the world. Having supported Amman's green plans to achieve a more sustainable, resilient, and fully decarbonized future, I know how challenging this could be. To put things into perspective, and by 2050, our global population will increase by 27% to 9.8 billion. And global floor area will increase by 100%, while energy demand will increase by 50%. I would now like to turn to our distinguished panelists and invite them to share with us some of their knowledge and wisdom. Let's imagine that a photographer hops on a time machine and arrives in the year 2050. He or she takes a photo of a city and comes back to this year, 2020. Please allow your imagination to flow and describe to us what you believe will be in that photo. So let's start with you, Emily.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I think what I would see in the year 2050 is hopefully not a city full of smog and cars and inefficient infrastructure. I don't think it'll be something that looks like the Jetsons either, which is always the image that you think of when you think of smart cities in the year, in the future. For me personally, I think it'll look similar to what we see in cities today, but the experience of being in that city taking that picture is going to be different. We're going to have more technology hanging off of streetlights, more devices in the right-of-way, for charging cars and connecting with citizens to provide services. I think you'll see less traffic because we'll be more efficient in managing it through technology. And I think you'll see a lot more citizens smiling because it'll be a much more pleasant place to live.
Beautiful. Dr. Colin, your insights, please.
Thank you, Mohammad, for the question, and good afternoon to everyone. So in 2050, someone returns, and what they've seen is potentially a city that has avoided all of the worst potentials of the new normal. And that is that the great realization has worked, and we don't have the current threat of pandemics or the potential threat of global warming. So a lot would have had to have happened down, in between 2020 and certainly to 2030, well before 2050, so that global warming averages had started to come down. And in terms of smart cities, we could imagine that instead of there just being a light application of smart technologies for personal or home use, that we would have seen governments actually partnering together, agreeing on solutions and looking potentially to the United Nations or World Health Organization and creating some kind of inroads towards our sustainable development goals. So that's going to be absolutely essential in 2050 to have the kind of future that we want, which is avoiding famine and warming. But it would also mean that those cities, or a particular city that was, say, a mega city and quite advanced, would have actually embraced ecologies of smart city objects, smart city meaning the data and sensors that cities use to assess and sense for information and create efficiencies in cities. So they would have had to have perhaps created platforms that are interlinked, platforms that actually give an overview, like two heads are better than one, creating coordinated outcomes that are, again, are aligned to preferred futures but avoid the worst possible futures. That's my first part of the answer.
Wonderful. We'll move on to Shakil.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammad, and thank you everyone for being on this distinguished panel. This is an interesting question because it just happened to be like a few months ago. I did write up a story about what Dhaka will look like in the year 2050, and I'll just take a snapshot from it. And in that snapshot, what you'll see is definitely the color green. It's the luscious green that the city of Dhaka has become. But also you will see public transport, like a zero waste bus. You will see men, women, boys, and girls walking, celebrating, and being able to play freely in these streets. And basically it's a celebration. It just happened to be the snapshot was a day of it was the 20-year anniversary of our government celebrating this idea of gross national inspiration. And we're all gathered at a local Tomorrowland. And Tomorrowland is basically a place in this park where we just, where time to time, it's a place where we gather and imagine the futures of our city. So that's where we are right now.
Great. Let's move on to another question that I would direct to Emily, please. And I'd like to ask you, how do agile cities and organizations respond better and faster to the changing dynamics of the new normal?
Sure. This is a great question, and especially pertinent given what cities are experiencing currently. Here in Philadelphia, we're on our second wave of COVID, with the numbers rising quite rapidly each day. We're experiencing the effects of climate change as we are a city located between two rivers. And we are, I guess, somewhat unique to the world, but not to the United States, in that we have social equity issues. We've had a lot of protests and uprisings as a result of some social issues. And so those are all our new normal. And I think, you know, if we're looking at that and how can we utilize smart cities and technology and data to really be responsive to this, I think we have to take a new perspective on what smart cities are trying to achieve. I think we're going to need to develop public-private partnerships. I even add the word plus, which means universities and utilities. I think everybody needs to come to the table and really work together. One of the impacts of COVID that has had on the city of Philadelphia is that we have a $750 million budget shortfall this year. And we are already known as the largest, poorest city in the United States with a population of just over 1.5 million. And now we are even poorer and being asked to provide services still. So I think for us, it's finding those partnerships and utilizing the resources we have that are not just financial, but what can those partnerships bring to the table? And I think we also are starting to look very hard at the policies that we have in place and how we can adjust them to be flexible for innovation. Cities are not really known, at least in the United States, for being adaptable. We are a hard ship to turn, right? And I think this new normal has shown us that we need to be able to pivot much more quickly. And so we need to take a hard look at how we are adjusting and kind of supporting the innovation to respond to this new normal and the new demands that come as a result of this.
Talking about pivoting, do you think that the business model behind the city itself needs to be looked into again and reconsidered?
That's a good question. I think everything right now needs to be looked into and reconsidered, to be honest. I think everybody should reevaluate the role that they play. I think the city serves a role of providing key services and fundamental rights to individuals. And I would say that in a large part, cities consistently do this. There are some cities that are not doing it as well as others. In Philadelphia, I think we're doing it really well. And my colleagues are working very hard in these trying times to continue to provide the same level, if not better, service. And if that's the role that the city needs to continue playing, then I think, the business model is one that works. If we look to change the business model and perhaps we become sellers of data, right, as a way of creating new revenue, that we enter into murky waters. And I think that it's just something that really needs to be considered, because does that align with what we as a city need to ultimately, like our fundamental responsibilities are?
Thanks a lot. Dr. Colin, could you comment on the same question, please?
Mohammad, I absolutely agree with Emily there. The new perspectives that cities need to take in terms of 2030 and smart cities must be embraced from within a vision, a wider view, not just a narrow vision, but something that's actually broad and holistic. And so that we are considering multiple systems, and I always work with 10, and I go through them rapidly: social, economic, legislative, environmental, cultural, transport, technology, governance, and politics. So we need to actually embrace systems that are outside the normal business as usual systems of the organisation. And the way we do that, as a futurist myself, we work with cities, the CEOs, the leaders, all the directors, the staff, and the communities. And we invite in the stakeholders from outside the city as well, the state and local governments from outside, and also national, and gather together a bigger picture of potential futures based on what they would like to see for the future, from all of the learning that they've managed to coalesce. And the interesting thing about smart cities now is we're starting to get products that are doing some of that crowdsourced knowledge, and like a Wikipedia-based system, or wiki system of gathering information online and actually sorting through problems and solutions via the internet. So actually mind-hiving data. And that's a real potential by 2030 that will be up and running. And the idea of visioning gives us this connection between digital platforms, digital software, but also that person-to-person human contact that will actually create a vision of not just technology before people, but people and the environment leading the way, so that technology can find solutions and answers to existing problems, but also allow us to venture forth and create solutions and find pathways to our dreams, our preferred futures for how we might envision the preferred city for coming generations. And we've got to keep that in mind if we aren't to lose all of the great customs and heritage that we've gained and that we've taken for granted in terms of a range of social but also environmental heritage and forests, and also our oceans not warming, plenty of food on the table. So there is plenty to look forward to if we can actually consider an holistic vision and embrace all of the potential possibilities via a negotiation process that means that we're inclusive and tolerant and open as societies.
Wonderful. Shakil, I think you live in Dhaka, and Dhaka is one of the densest, most dense cities, if not the most dense city in the world. So your perspective here is extremely appreciated.
No, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, we do talk about 10 million people in Dhaka. And of course, 10 million is a number that's bigger than countries at times. But then even within all this, life does go on. And of course, I think when it comes to the question of the new normal, I mean, something that I think I even came across today is like who is this new normal for? Like who's new normal, right? And the idea is that who wins in the new normal, right? And a lot of the scenarios that we see is that the same people that were winning in the old normal are the people who are winning in the new normal, right? So most planning seems to be around like benefiting the same sort of stakeholders, and I think as Emily was mentioning, given the social equity issue that even Philadelphia is also facing, whether it's Bangladesh or other parts of the world, right? I think futures planning, foresight thinking can really help us like question our basic assumptions that like things cannot go on based on the assumptions that we had before the virus, and we really need to be creatively imagine how different our lives would need to be in the city for a future that works for all of us. So.
I think you've raised a very important issue about the beneficiaries. So how do we disrupt this cycle?
Yeah, I mean that's not the easy one, right? Because I think there are definitely multiple power dynamics at play, but I think trust building is definitely important. Building trust is not necessarily a very costly exercise, right? It's relatively cheap. There are particular facilitation activities you can do, and I think how even Dr. Colin mentioned about including the stakeholders bringing them into the same room, right? Sometimes people who, like the way that our cities sometimes develop is that people who are very, very different to each other, there are not enough spaces in the cities where these people come together and actually talk together. And I think even Alan de Botton, in one of his books, he mentions that only times where we find that people of different classes or different contexts come into a city together, it's either when it comes to disasters where people come together, or when it's maybe potentially in religious spaces, right? But even then, I think so. Yeah, I think sometimes these stakeholder workshops or gatherings can be a way of breaking that. And I think the Tomorrowland's idea that I mentioned before is also trying to see whether we can create a public space where, irrespective of who you are, can you come together and meet someone that's very different from you, but discuss about the future of your area together.
That's amazing. Yes, excellent. So Emily.
Yes, I just wanted to add on to what Shakil was saying about the building of the trust and ensuring that everybody has a spot at the table. I think we're seeing that a lot as a result of COVID. It's amplifying things that have existed in cities for decades, especially around the digital divide. And I think that plays into smart cities and how we engage with the community, is really understanding, we think, well, we can send out digital surveys, or we can do something, everybody must have a computer at home, or everybody must have a smartphone and know how to use it and actually to achieve. And so I think it's even more important in terms of building the trust that cities deploy multiple ways of engaging them, both technology-wise and actually having meetings with them in a safe way, given the constraints of COVID. But it's just very important to acknowledge that not everybody has access to the technology. And if we're trying to make a smarter city, everybody has to be smarter, not just the people who can afford it or the people who can make sure that their voices are heard.
Talking about technology and the digital divide, I think Bangladesh has a experience that it could share with the world in predicting flooding. Since you are in the education sector as well, and you come from Bangladesh, could you elaborate on this, please?
Yeah, and I think, over the years, I think it's our government, and in working with multiple civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations have really come up with much better systems in becoming much more resilient with floods. And of course, grassroots communities have become much more wiser in dealing with it. Of course, I'm not going to pretend that it's not a problem, that people's livelihoods still get affected. Like, it's not like it's all is good. That is not the case. But then I think it's definitely not not the disaster that it used to be at some point. And of course, right now we're facing a new disaster, right? I mean, whatever is going on. And I think some lessons can be taken, but I do think that it's something completely new that at least our government is dealing with right now. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll go back to Dr. Colin, and my question is, what needs to be done to enable cities to become more responsive, adaptable, and make smarter decisions?
Well, it is similar to what we've been talking about, in the sense that we have to start with a comprehensive vision for the city. And on the Gold Coast, that meant for me actually going around the city and consulting in 26 different forums, actually talking across multiple systems, inviting stakeholders from those areas. But to make those smarter decisions, creating trust is incredibly vital, as Shakil and Emily have pointed out. And we have a city called Darwin in which they tried to create facial recognition systems, or put facial recognition towers in place without consulting their communities. And you can't actually do that very successfully. In Australia, it's a democratic system. You cannot put in place facial recognition towers like many countries without getting a lot of negative feedback from communities wondering about privacy of that data. What is it being used for? Who is watching that? Where is it stored? So you have to build up a lot of trust before we can actually develop and deliver smart city technology effectively without it actually being an adverse impact on the city. And so that will have impacts on new technologies like Neuralink that Elon Musk is developing, which is actually an idea of actually embedding a chip into the brain and communicating using our minds from person to person, just like Wi-Fi from computer to computer. So inevitably, we're going to have an enormous amount of trust built up. So stakeholder consultation and clarifying the rules will be the only way forward to actually do that. If we're going to make smarter decisions and use these technologies, we have to start at a very human level to begin with. And there's a whole range of we're actually promising to our next generation that we'll continue this journey of moving through the eras of from the Stone Age to Metal Age to now to the Communication Age. That there's always going to be another age of complex and wonderful scientific development and human evolution in that sense, and that our powers of intellect and education are unlimited, and we can only continue if we firstly protect our environment and our resources, and create sustainability and pathways that we can actually believe in and commit to. And part of that, because if in times of global economic crisis or pandemics, there's enormous amounts of unrest. So we aren't able to settle in and use our technologies that require trust. So firstly, we've got to create the baseline regenerative pathways to the future and clear out fossil fuels successfully. And that's where most money is being developed in terms of smart cities at the moment. It's in green technology. There's more people employed now in wind and solar than there is in fossil fuels. And all of the dashboard technologies that go into sensing the environment and linking in and making those systems better is what smart city technology should be all about. It's that promise to future generations that we're going to get it right and we'll continue to do the right thing. Not profit before people, but next generations before profit.
The issue of trust seems to be coming up every now and then. And if you link it to the issue of privacy, it also becomes more important. And I remember reading a book for a guy called Fukuyama, where he mentions that trust is a very important enabler of economic prosperity. So trust is an extremely important issue to be discussed, especially in a digital world. Could you, Emily, expand on this and provide us with your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. I think right now, at least again in the US, I don't want to speak for any other cities, but trust in cities is at an all-time low. Trust in government is at an all-time low. And I think it's not only about building up trust, and Colin's a reference to the surveillance towers is a prime example that we're going through here in Philadelphia, but also in the US. We're currently about to issue an RFP to upgrade our street light fixtures to LED fixtures. And the opportunity is also there to enhance connectivity and deploy sensors and potentially optical sensors. And there's a lot of concern around how that will go and how we can build trust with the community because of the Black Lives Matter uprisings and the use of surveillance to target certain individuals because of other cities. I wasn't aware of Darwin, but I'm going to add them to my list of cities to look into as we're kind of developing our own privacy policies and data policies. San Diego has been having some trouble with the deployment of their smart city light poles and surveillance or sensors because of lack of communication and not developing that trust with the community. But then I think it's also important to not just say, okay, we built the trust, now we can move forward. I think it's very much how do we sustain this trust and how do we continue to build moving forward with transparency. And so we're looking at things like setting up a task force, a third-party task force that can automatically kind of check in on what technologies we have and ensure that they are not doing more harm than good, which is a very big concern. We're looking at potentially partnering with an Israeli company to do sentiment tracking. So as another tool of getting a better pulse of what's happening in the city, utilizing AI to look at social media accounts and news accounts and whatnot and try to harvest sentiment so that we can better address our messaging to the community, understanding what they're feeling and whatnot. So it is at the front and center of everything we're trying to do within the smart city world in Philadelphia, knowing that if we don't have trust through transparency and engagement and equitable engagement, I think that that's another key word, equitable and inclusive, then we will not be a successful smart city.
Thank you for bringing up the issue of public engagement. I think since we are talking about the new normal, the only way to build trust is through ensuring that we have systems within cities that ensure public engagement and where citizens would feel that they are part of the decision-making process. Shakil?
I think I just wanted to build on it, like even from an educational perspective, that I think one thing that we probably need innovation on is pedagogy. Right, and if any of if you've heard about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like over there in particular, like a lot of our pedagogies, the way we teach people, whether it's true in the classroom or beyond the classroom, is very top down in its approach. Right, it's coming from the news, it's coming from like you can't interact with it. Right, even now I'm lecturing, no one's being able to talk to me. I can say whatever I want. Right, that's just a one-way flow. Right, but when it comes to building trust, it really has to be a two-way conversation, right? And instead of being a teacher and a student, there has to be teacher students and student teachers, right? You become both, and it's really a different pedagogical structure, right? It's not like students looking at the teacher in the classroom, but being in a circle, right? And I think, and the reason why I'm saying this because there's a lack of there's a top-down pedagogical approach, not just in schools, but in religious spaces, in political spaces, in the workplace when your employer talks to the employee, like it's everywhere, right? And so really how we actually teach each other or converse to each other, that has to change. And I think cities can be designed to have more spaces where people can come together and have those conversations. A lot of those cities don't have these spaces to have those conversations. And I think even for civic trust to be built, I think in city design, we can also think about where do people actually come together and meet and have these conversations.
Amazing. From a appreciative inquiry perspective, I think it's really important that the relationship is no longer a subject-object relationship, but more of a subject relationship where people are equal, and that would eventually create the trust that we are looking for. Okay, so I have one last question for all of our panelists, which is, what can we do to be able to plan for the future of a Vuca world? And we'll start with you, Dr. Colin.
Thanks for this challenging question. In terms of the Vuca word, volatility and uncertainty and complexity and perhaps ambiguity. What we do as futurists is to try to we map the current situation and scan the environment. We anticipate potentially emerging issues, and we try to understand what time frame we're working in the macroscopic sense of macro historical sense of the world, and then we create and deepen new strategies, and then we backcast. We try to create a preferred future and backcast from that, and not project forward a linear future. So when we plan for the future of a Vuca world, we are actually keeping in mind the preferred future and not just the possible worst case scenario. But there are many scenarios here in terms of smart cities, and we need to avoid looking back to the past to try to find too many solutions that don't involve smart cities and technologies, because we're going to have to become more efficient than we've ever been in history. We are going to have to create platforms that link across systems to try to not reinvent the wheel, but to educate people and to keep progress moving forward. And one way that smart cities can then help is to digitally twin the future. And we know that that kind of means that, like NASA did when they sent a spacecraft around the moon, they had a working model here on planet Earth. And digitally twinning means that we've got a potential way of assessing the future, running scenarios, appreciating that in a virtual reality sense. And we can only really do that through human connection and getting that 24/7 citizen you'll say feedback. And I mean 24/7 because emerging issues change constantly. And that gives us grounding for wanting to continue that dialogue with citizenry to build that trust, and then build that in build in information systems and learning through dashboard systems that the community can see. They can actually track the status of the city online, not just the weather, but a whole range of forecasts. How are we doing in terms of jobs and joblessness? Do we need to create a universal basic income? How are we doing in terms of social equity? Do we need more legislation to create more ethical workplaces? How are we doing in terms of the environment? Is sustainability on track, or are we going to end up flooding parts of the city by 2050 or 2060? So we need this information. We need it 24/7, and we need that process of information to be two-way interactive, as Shakil has pointed out.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I like to describe myself as an urbanist with a passion for city systems. And so, of course, my response is going to have to do with that. I think we need to make sure that we're taking a systems approach with a vision. So to what Colin was saying, we need to know where we want to go, what is the world that we want to see, and continue to check in on that vision, but also understand that a city operates as a system and doesn't operate in silos and divides. So I think we need to ensure that it's human-centered, that as we're developing this vision, that we're better connecting the dots from what the community needs to actions. I think a lot of times what we see in smart cities is that we are, I actually compare it to like a COVID test. We are getting data that tells us how we're doing right then and now at this moment, but it doesn't tell us where we want to be or how we want to get there. And so I think we need to make sure that we're very much action oriented, and that we're always approaching things through a lens of equity and inclusion. When I talk about systems, we're doing work here in Philadelphia where we're looking at the public realm and taking microscale data and using that to do things to encourage interventions in communities that can have an effect on violence levels. But what that's also doing is having an economic effect, because we're improving the quality of neighborhoods that have long been disinvested, right? We're improving air quality because we're greening the neighborhood through those investments. We're helping reduce the comorbidities that COVID and probably other pandemics would prey on. But we're also helping the environment because these communities are often the ones that shoulder the burden of environmental events in our city. They suffer from urban flooding and heat island. And so that one single intervention is actually hitting the economics, the environmental, and the social components that we want to make sure that as we're moving forward in a world that is uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and volatile, that we're making sure we're bringing everybody with us in an equitable and inclusive way.
Thank you, Emily. Shakil.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when it comes to the whole the Vuca state, the volatile and complex and ambiguous state, it's easy for someone to feel an individual to feel disempowered, that they don't have agency over what they do. And I think even Dr. Colin alluded to it. I mean, the idea of transformative futures thinking can definitely help people to regain that agency, to regain that hope towards that future. But having said that, I think what's really important about it all, and I think Sohail and Atullah, another futurist, has a framework called causal layered analysis, like the importance of the narrative, right? Like sometimes we can come up with different city policies, city laws, well-intentioned, but they don't get implemented because people's mindsets haven't changed. And people's mindsets haven't changed because people's myths and metaphors and narratives have not changed, right? And so at the core, the story of the city is very important. And each city is telling a story, right? When you walk in it, you can hear that story speaking to you, right? And what is this story as it is now? And what is the story that we want it to be? And that story has to be spread in multiple different ways. And of course, it doesn't have to be a single story. It can be a whole landscape of stories, but the story has to be in cartoons like the Jetsons, or in images, or in photographs, but it has to come in different ways. And as you can see, like the Jetsons was powerful because it gives you an idea of the future city, but then that's not necessarily the city that we want to aspire to, given what we know now. So what our children, right, or even our adults being exposed to the imagination of what our current cities can look like. So even with the word smart, right? The word smart always usually means tech savvy, but doesn't necessarily mean inclusive or trustworthy. And those are also should also be a part of what smartness actually means. And I think one particular thing that I'm playing around with is this idea of gross national inspiration. And of course, you guys may have heard of gross national happiness in Bhutan. Japan and Korea talk about gross national coolness, like how cool a country can be. But gross national inspiration is like how would you design your city so that the citizens of that particular city are inspired, but they're also inspiring to other cities around it, right? So similarly, even if you take an area of the city, can an area of itself be inspired and inspiring? And and what would the design of that place be? And I hope that, given these concepts, given these changes of narratives, given that people have a sense of ownership and a reimagined identity of what the city means to them, can really help us navigate the tensions that comes with a Vuca world, so that we do feel the hope and agency towards working towards it.
I love the positive spirit that this group has. But before I conclude, I want to come back to you, Dr. Colin. You mentioned the issue of linearity in planning for the future. And the problem is that when you plan based on what is, sometimes you do not anticipate the potential of what could be. So how could we design the future in a completely different approach that could construct a tomorrow that is totally different than it is today?
Well, definitely, that is the problem with projecting in terms of business as usual future. And if we constructed 4 scenarios around smart cities, the probably the preferred would be an integrated scenario that actually captures parts of the disowned and deals with those issues, captures cities that want to put technology first and identify what their intent is and integrates that, identifies the cities that want to put social and environmental issues like Oroville, put those issues first and identify, oh, that actually means that you're integrating and, say, putting a transit system in place that considers the end destination after you get out of the train station or the bus station. How do you get to your home? Are there green solutions for that? So little things that, you know, the small steps that build up into a bigger picture, and integrate those sorts of, those sorts of scenarios. So that different cities are at different stages, and we must embrace a solution for all of those cities. So I think of it in terms of creating a vision for the future that unites everyone and aligns us all to sustainable development goals, but also to the preferred futures that each of those individual cities has. And so there we're talking really large scale about developing countries and emerging countries. We're talking about the larger mega cities and all the cities in between that are perhaps not capital cities, but are in urban and regional and rural situations. So we need to actually create standardized city plans and visions around smart cities, but we also need to customize, and that means engaging. That means actually going out and conducting futures exercises and bringing futures thinking into councils. And here in Queensland, the way that we've done that successfully in the last 50 years, the only 1 or 2 times that we've done that successfully is when our visions have been legislated and the cities have been required to put all of that intellect and that work into creating scenarios with communities into a long-term plan that is separate to the city plan or separate to the corporate plan and the annual reporting process. It's a 10-year community plan, and then it's integrated back in to the corporate plan and the council meeting and decision-making process. But it was legislated, and that was the driving mechanism behind all of that work happening, because it can cost $500,000 to $1 million to actually do the marketing and do the work required But then, as we've experienced in the Gold Coast, you know, a $5 to $6 billion health and knowledge precinct has emerged from that process. That is, we ran the Commonwealth Games out of that process. The health and knowledge precinct is now connected by light rail. We've got these amazing new stadiums that have been put in place. So we've got this mapping and ecology of a city being interlinked and interconnected, instead of being in silos as individual hubs or village hubs, which was the previous kind of vision for the city. So certainly we need to create long-term visioning processes and then add the technology in to support feedback mechanisms, so have your say sites, the surveys, and also the mind hive processes that will eventually come on board.
Thank you all. I think this was a wonderful discussion, and in which we learned that the cities of the future require a lot of trust building, a lot of education, utilization of available technology. It's a multi-layered process and requires a lot of change in the way we think and the way we do things. Thank you all for a wonderful time we spent in discussing the future that we would like to construct together. And with this, I would like to conclude this session and open the floor for questions and answers.
And a big thanks to you, Mohammad. Thank you so much for moderating that panel there. Really a dynamic discussion in terms of building smart and resilient cities. So much unfolding in that conversation there, and I'm delighted that we're going to have time to actually continue that conversation. A huge thanks to Shakil, Ahmed, who is with us there, and Emily Yates. They couldn't stay with us. And of course, a big happy Thanksgiving to all of our American viewers as well. It is the holiday in the US, so we're very happy for those who have managed to tune in. The early bird, so to speak, in the US, but we know it's a very, very busy day in the US. So staying with us for this conversation, I'm delighted to have Dr. Colin Russo is still with us, and Mohammad Asfour is with us for this Q&A. So thank you both so much for being with us. Now, building smart and resilient cities, so much that goes in there. And of course, I suppose we look at what's happened, with regards to the fallout of the pandemic and the fact that so much had to be done so quickly. But of course, we need to look at the longer term. And Dr. Colin, if I may start with you, big focus on the recovery right now, but everybody really needs to be looking to the future. And do you think that there's enough going on in terms of looking to the future, or is there a danger? A lot of cities, and even as Emily mentioned there, might be broke by the end of this year. So it's also building back better, but probably building back with a tighter budget maybe as well. So lots of challenges.
Thanks, Edna. Yes, the challenge there certainly is to create stimulus in local economies, state and national economies. It's all about jobs, job-led recovery, and it certainly is about stimulating through construction as the big ticket items that will help, get these sort of large job-ready projects moving very, very quickly. But a lot of that, the planning that has created the ability to get a big ticket item job moving very quickly, all of that planning has happened in the last 3 years. So there's a lot of corporate planning, strategic planning, and engineers and construction teams working together with private industry to develop the plans and deliver the projects that are going ahead now. So these sorts of projects will have to be joined and integrated with a longer term vision that cities should have and states will have, so that we get integrated planning, not ad hoc planning. And of course, the other problem is if you're going to be working with construction and you're going to be employing smart city technologies, you have to ensure that you're working with the right partners. And a lot of what the construction teams are saying at the moment is, in terms of smart city technology, is that they're dealing with data security issues, real-time insight issues. That's what they'd really like to have in terms of smart city technology, so that they can plan and integrate their projects with longer-term emerging issues. The ability to effectively manage risk, being able to complete projects on time, work safety issues, and of course, mapping together outdated technologies in one language, one computing language, and having them speak to many languages. So there are a range of construction and project team engineering solutions that are needing to be found, and that these big construction item projects are going to help be the conduits for solutions in terms of the next 3 years. But it all has to be, all of this stimulus needs to be happening within a longer term, bigger picture framework. The reason that we've got a pandemic problem at the moment is, potentially because we've started to encroach into new environments, into new habitats, and transport is now global. So if you put those two issues together, you've got the potential for new diseases to travel quite quickly. And so the idea of COVID-19 itself is not new, in the sense that we've had SARS and other major illnesses, major diseases, but it's being managed better because we do have smart city technologies, because we do have the ability to get information out quickly and corral solutions and major construction teams to get jobs happening very, very quickly. But it doesn't stop us from improving the way we respond, not just to pandemics, but to potential other risks that are emerging as global risks. Global warming is absolutely huge on the radar right now. And it means that big countries, you've just seen Joe Biden as president-elect coming out with a new strategy saying by 2050 you'd like to see the United States carbon neutral. And together with that aim, recognising that the United States is just a 13% contributor to global emissions. And so the whole idea of reducing carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, but certainly methane as well, means that they are only going to be potentially able to reduce by 13%. They need their international partners. And that's where diplomacy and, again, smart city technology can integrate to create a global solution to a borderless risk problem.
And that's indeed what's needed. But again, I think too, the very sentiment in terms of coming, that message coming from the US is just so powerful. And again, it's something that will, have ripple effect and will, and the markets have been driven by sentiment. So, a lot of people will take that as a very, very strong message, I think. And indeed, Mohammed, for you too, this must be, a strong message, a good message. But also when we look at building cities and building that resilience into them, it's also about building sustainability in there. And I really think we're beginning to see a shift. And in the last 4 days, we've certainly heard it here from the experts right around the world, looking at more sustainability and looking at building green and clean for the future. I think it's on everybody's mind. This must be encouraging for you.
It surely is. And we feel very positive about some of the changes that happened recently, especially in the US. So we look forward to a greener future, hopefully.
Now, when we look at, standards in smart cities, and again, we also look at this in, I suppose, the context of, the recessionary environment that we're in at the moment. There are many people out there who might be thinking that this is a lot of investment and a lot of money when the economy is in the doldrums and companies are downsizing and lots of jobs are at stake. They might just wonder, is, smartening up the city digitally and technologically, is this the best way to actually spend that money? When we look at the social side of this, Colin, ultimately, is it about looking to the longer term? Because this, we hope, is a temporary situation that we're in right now.
Well, certainly, Edna, yes, thanks. Great question, because the social aspects are vital if we're not to just simply put technology first and then realise that our solutions aren't integrated with what people really want or need, and in a range of contexts. So there isn't a one solution fits all technology solution here. We are talking about moving from different environments such as urban and regional cities to capital cities, but also between emerging nations and more advanced economies and mega cities with the capacities and resources to not only develop but deliver and implement, and for the consumers themselves to own that technology and actually use that technology. And we're seeing vast changes in emerging economies. For example, the Philippines now being a major user and major consumer of new technology. And what that means is we've got more people on the internet, hundreds of millions of more people actually joining the global market economy. And that is going to create massive productivity shifts and increase the potential for solutions if those solutions are mapped into a sustainable network of perhaps development goals. So we certainly have got a lot to look forward to, whether that's just in terms of pure infrastructure construction, or whether that's in terms of, say, medical construction or, say, medical technology. And we've all heard about CRISPR, and everyone's talking about the longevity of life, that social aspect of living longer, but also living happier and healthier. And that's where having a smart city vision and integrating it to a social and environmental goal is the way to sort of lead and create a focus that's not just on GDP, gross domestic product, but is also on a focus on happiness and wellness. And that is certainly something that we've got to look forward to. And certainly technology will be a major driver. There are now more jobs in the green renewable sector than there are in fossil fuels. We've just seen Elon Musk propose a solution in the US for giving Wi-Fi out globally and potentially for free via satellites, developing the internet in space via satellites so that we don't have that infrastructure cost. And we can immediately get the Wi-Fi out to all of those hundreds of millions of people in those developing economies. So there are certainly a lot of stimulus measures coming on board with smart technology leading us. We've just got to ensure that they are helping to create a sustainability development outcome.
Indeed, it is. It's all about building scale as well. Mohammad, when we think about, the bigger global agendas, and I think in terms of, cutting emissions and something that everybody needs to see, we're also seeing, move to the cities and more people moving into the cities. This is a trend, I believe, that certainly will continue to happen. But, can we actually align the global agenda with local action and, even the work from what you're doing in the World Green Building Council as well, our towns and cities doing their bit, and does every little bit help, because every city and every country is not going to take the same action, but at the same time, it's no excuse for not taking action. Mohammad.
Exactly. So as you mentioned, every little bit matters. And we should integrate the global agenda into local agendas, from a small village in Africa to a mega city in China. All have to decarbonize by the year 2050 to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And I feel that there are several areas that we really need to look into now post the pandemic era, or hopefully post-pandemic era in a year's time or so. So what the pandemic has taught us is that what we learned from that is that the challenges were always there, the opportunities were always there, but the pandemic amplified the impact. So the solutions already existed. Now, what we hope to see is that these solutions that we already knew existed are taken upfront and made use of. So, for example, decarbonizing the built environment. This requires us to have every building as a net zero building by the year 2050. This is something achievable. I think the main barrier lies within our minds, unfortunately, because technology allows for a lot of this, and it does make business sense. So finance should not be an issue, because when we talk about sustainability, we're talking also about many benefits, including resource efficiency. This pandemic has taught us that we cannot continue living the way we have done in the past. It tells us that our health matters. So health and well-being is a very important issue. And we, as the World GBC, launched recently our guidelines for health and well-being. We have 6 pillars. If applied within the built environment, then they would surely improve the health and well-being of people. So health and well-being, net zero buildings, climate action, resource efficiency, all of these would apply from this anyway, from a village to a mega city. And in all cases, we need to ensure that there is public engagement, that there is trust building, and that people do have a voice and do have a say in how we could turn our reality from the reality we are facing today to a more positive and sustainable reality in the future.
And that's ultimately, I think, what everybody wants to do, indeed, around the world. Colin, if I may come to you, and we've had several questions in here talking about, but smart cities, will they not be too expensive to live in? Can people actually afford to live in a smarter city? But also, people worried about, are they going to have to compromise their freedom because the city is smarter and knows where we are at what time and knows what we're doing and knows maybe too much information about us. So maybe a word of reassurance to people out there in terms of, cost and livability. And if you could just address that before we close, Colin.
Oh, thanks. Great question. I think it begins with having a good connection between the communities, non-government organisations and the sectors of industry, and with their government leaders and representatives. And that will give them the reassurance that the government and leaders are listening because you can only introduce, for example, a facial recognition system if there is community consultation and if there is good legislation for its operation, such that there's privacy laws in place and people understand how that data will be used and used for purposes to actually save money, save policing time, get better outcomes, particularly as populations grow. And one of the ways that we've done that before is to conduct a visioning exercise in a city of 550,000 on the Gold Coast, delivered 26 workshops and gathered leaders internally and externally around the city, and got the agency, built the agency or the self-empowerment of those community organisations and the leaders in the city, and built an engagement framework called Your Say, put it onto the internet, and develop 24/7 feedback mechanisms. So that's to build trust and make sure that it's integrated between local, state and federal.
And I suppose, I mean, all of this too is, it's a work in progress, actually. And I think we can all learn from cities who have implemented some interesting prospects at the moment, and we can see how that works and, see how it doesn't work. And hopefully everybody will learn with the finest case studies. We have to leave it there. I really want to thank you all for taking the time. Again, a big thanks to Emily and Shakil, who were here with us earlier, and to Dr. Colin Russo and to Mohammad Asfour, of course, there. Thank you so much for having a look at the smart and resilient cities of the future, and looking at how we're all going to approach the new normal in years to come. Thank you so much.